Hello, my name is Palanivel Thiaga Rajan and I am the MLA for Madurai Central Constituency representing the DMK party. I am here today to help discuss a report I've been preparing over the last 3 to 4 weeks, reviewing the state of Tamil Nadu's finances in anticipation of the budget session which is due to start in a few days. I have titled this report, Drowning in Debt and the Worst is Yet to Come. I want to go over a few points in the course of this presentation. And before I do that, I want to explain to you why I created this report. On the 1st of February 2017, the government of Tamil Nadu laid on the table of the House a report that is required under the Tamil Nadu Fiscal Responsibility Act. This report showed the trend of expenditure and receipts over the first 6 months of the budget year. This report was quite alarming to me. It showed a state of affairs that was much worse than I had anticipated. The second reason I'm doing this report is because the leader of my party, opposition party leader, as well as the working president of the DMK through M.K.Stalin, had his own analysis done and showed that the state's finances were in very bad shape. He therefore asked me to dig a lot deeper into the historical data and uncover how and why we arrived at this place. You may have also noticed in the last week or so some mentions in the newspaper about some aspects of the state's financial dilemma. For example, that the public distribution system, or the ration shops as we know them, are not able to supply goods like dal and palm oil because the procurement contracts are not being executed due to lack of liquidity. Finally, my own colleagues as MLAs and former MLAs and government workers who are due pensions from the government of Tamil Nadu have been in touch with me and explained that reimbursements from the Legislative Assembly Department, which is for travel allowance, medical charges, etc., are being experienced in terms of checks that are paid which are not honored by the banks. In other words, the Legislative Assembly Department's checks are being turned back from banks. Simultaneously, pensions that ought to be paid are not being paid for ex-MLAs and government workers, or in some cases being paid in 2 different monthly installments. Now, I don't expect that the fate of MLAs and their payments are of common concern to most people, and rightly so, they shouldn't be, especially those MLAs who were recently locked up in a resort for several days. On the other hand, as I have said in the past, if people with access to the sources of power and sources of government, like MLAs and retired MLAs, find themselves in this bad a situation, then surely common people must find their situation even worse. So for all these reasons, I chose to make this report. And in order to make it easier to digest, I have broken this report into 5 simple pieces. For those who have never analyzed the budget before and don't understand the components, I have 2 different sections that will help to provide an introduction. The first is called How to Analyze Budgets, and the second is called Responsible Financial Management. That is, what is the gold standard for how to manage the finances of an entity like the state of Tamil Nadu, or for that matter, the country of India. And then I have 2 sections which analyze the performance of Tamil Nadu finances from both the revenue account perspective, or the current account perspective, as well as the fiscal account perspective, which is the long-term investment and debt account perspective. And finally, I have a section that concludes the full analysis by reiterating where we stand today and what we expect to see in the future. The first scope of analysis in any budget is called revenue receipts and revenue expenditures. That is current year income and current year expenditure. For a government like that of Tamil Nadu, there are basically 4 sources of income or receipts. 1, the state's own tax revenues, which is largely commercial taxes, things like VAT. 2, the state's non-tax revenues, which is things like registration fees for land transactions or automobile registrations. 3, the state share of taxes that are collected by the central government and sent back, like income taxes and service taxes. And lastly, central government funding for certain specific programs or schemes which are called grants in aid. These are the four main sources of revenue from a current account perspective for any state. In terms of expenses, there are 5 or 6 categories. First is salary and allowances for government servants, MLAs, etc. Second is pensions and retirement benefits. Third is what we call non-wage operations and maintenance, which is electric bills, maintenance, routine maintenance to keep buildings and assets functional, equipment functional, etc. Fourth, by far the largest and most important, subsidies and transfers, that is the government programs like free laptops or the public distribution system. Fifth, interest payments, that is payments that are due for debt already incurred by the government. And lastly, any other sources of income. The next aspect is what we call fiscal accounts or capital accounts. Now, in this case, there may be 2 variations. The first is called revenue surplus variation, and that is when your revenue receipts are greater than your revenue expenditures, so you actually have a revenue surplus, and you use that to fund capital expenditures, including some additional borrowing. So for example, in this case, where you have a revenue surplus, which is the model that most of the DMK governments have followed, you increase the debt a little bit, borrow, add it to your revenue surplus, and use that for capital investments like roads, bridges, power plants, factories, sewage schemes, etc. On the other hand, if, like the ADMK government has done the last 2 years and is projecting to do this year, if you run a revenue deficit, that is to say that you have spent more this year than you earned this year, then you first have to borrow to fix this deficit, fix the revenue deficit, and then whatever you have left of your borrowing, you can invest in capital investments, like in this case, roads or factories. This is, of course, a much less preferred model, because if you borrow to finance current account deficits, you are unlikely to get any growth benefit and therefore future benefits from this. Whereas if you invest in infrastructure and investment of capital, you will in fact get future benefits from this. Now, I realize this is going a bit long, but I want to wrap this in 2 or 3 slides. We have already discussed, therefore, what is a revenue account or current year account, receipts, which come from 4 categories, tax and non-tax revenues, central share of taxes, as well as grants, expenditures that are salaries, pensions, operations and maintenance, schemes, and net interest. A capital account, which is the revenue surplus or deficit plus investments, and these investments can sometimes be direct investments, sometimes they're net loans or advances which are given to wholly owned corporations like the State Transport Corporation or the TNEB to help build assets on its balance sheet. 2 other terms to be really clear about in terms of financial analysis. The first is called retail inflation, which is the price at which, or the rate at which the cost of living goes up year over year, and therefore at some level the rate at which the value of a rupee drops year over year. Now, this is an important statistic because the way we measure a state's economic progress is called GSDP, Gross State Domestic Product. And in most years, from a current year perspective, this GSDP will be measured only in notional rupees or current rupees, because current income, current expenses, current investment is all in today's rupees. However, if we really want to know how much the state has grown, we must take out the effects of inflation or the lowering in value of the rupee and calculate what's known as real GSDP growth. So we need to know what is retail inflation in order to calculate rate of GSDP growth. However, when we do calculations of GSDP, we do it only in today's rupees, because all other budget terms are also in today's rupees. So if you look at this overall from a performance perspective, the questions are, is there a revenue surplus or is there a revenue deficit? In other words, do receipts exceed expenditures or vice versa? You must remember that as debt goes up, interest payments go up. And as interest payments are part of revenue expenditures, every time you have interest payments go up, you either squeeze other programs that the state can spend on, or you increase your revenue deficit. Similarly, the fiscal deficit for our simple analysis is just equal to the capital spending less the revenue surplus, or the capital spending plus the revenue deficit which has to be financed. And the long-term debt of the state, or the overall debt level of the state, simply increases every year by the amount of fiscal deficit that you get. And as the debt goes up, then the interest goes up. and then you have a chance of greater deficit next year because you have more interest to pay next year. In this section, I will briefly review what distinguishes responsible financial management from irresponsible ones or less than stellar ones, and talk a little bit about the history of this analysis that has already been done before. I've mentioned in the past that in 2003, the government of Tamil Nadu passed an act called the Fiscal Responsibility Act. This act is consistent with a series of acts that were passed at both the central government as well as many states, and part of a bundle that the center brought in called the FRMBM, Financial Responsibility and Budget Management Act. It was mandated for states to get full benefits from central governments to pass equivalent acts. In Tamil Nadu, the act passed in 2003 asked for progressively improving budgets and financial management, leading to an ultimate goal originally set for an early date, but then moved back due to changing circumstances. And the goals were very simple. For our purposes, we really need to think of only two immediate goals. First goal, always run a revenue neutral account. That is, don't run current account or revenue account deficits. Always make sure the revenue is either zero or surplus. Second, always maintain fiscal deficits to less than 3% of GSDP. Because on the one hand, while it's good to invest in capital projects, and if you have to borrow for it, it's great, it's okay, it's acceptable, you can pay it back out of the benefits of the projects, you cannot borrow too rapidly or your interest payments will overwhelm everything else. So the two goals, remember, no revenue deficits and less than 3% fiscal deficit. This was supposed to be achieved first by 2008, then pushed to 10, 12, and so forth because of inability to meet those. And every time the goals were not met, the legislature of Tamil Nadu met and amended the target dates, but it is now in full effect for this year, 2016-17. In addition, the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, recently published a report about March of 2016 reviewing data up to 2015 of all the different states' performance in budget management and growth across India. And in that report, it said a few different interesting things. The first, it said there are some states that after the passage of responsibility acts have fundamentally improved their finances and improved their budget controls and have seen great benefits from it. And states like Maharashtra and Gujarat. And then other states like UP have not done so and have therefore not seen the consequences. Of more granular clarity, they made 2 or 3 points. They said, if a state controls interest payments as a percentage of its total spending and instead spends on good programs, then it is likely to see future growth. Similarly, if a state keeps its fiscal deficit only for capital investment and doesn't finance revenue deficits from fiscal deficits, then it is likely to see future growth. Conversely, those states that don't have this kind of responsibility will see reduced growth in the future. The most important point to remember, in that report, it clearly shows Tamil Nadu as being one of the good states till 2013-14. However, when I first became an MLA and attended my first budget session last July, the amended budget after the interim budget was passed before the elections, I noticed some glaring discrepancies in the data in terms of the quality of financial management and the responsibility of the government. I made a few points. The first point I made was that the first 3 years of the last government had been managed fundamentally better than the last 2 years. And in particular, I said, every year in the last 2 years, that is 14-15 and 15-16, whatever the rate of growth of the economy was, the rate of government receipts was lower than that, and the rate of spending was higher than that. So every single year, for 2 years, economy grows at X, revenue grows at less than X, or receipts grow at less than X, and spending grows at greater than X. Of course, you can imagine this is a recipe for increasing deficits. I also said every year the government budgeted a certain amount of revenue from taxes and missed it 2 years in a row by 20%. And it did not have this infirmity or this inability to achieve its targets was not present in 11-12 or 12-13 or 13-14, but was present in 14-15 and 15-16. At which point I asked the government, does this indicate that you are not able to execute the plan that you say you have, or are you just making up fake plans to make the budget look responsible, knowing full well that you cannot achieve these targets? Of course, the ministers gave me all kinds of responses saying that I wasn't really aware of what I was doing. The second set of points I made was related to capital investment. I said again, in both 14-15 and 15-16, you were not able to achieve the capital investment targets that you set. You say you're a high growth regime, and yet you first set low targets, that is as percentage of GSDP or as percentage of the budget. Your capital plans are modest at best, and even those you fail to achieve. And how is that any way compatible to your statement of being a visionary government, having a Vision 2023 document and saying that you are growing the state by investment? The final point I made was that in the 5 years of ADMK regime, debt had more than doubled from a little over 1 crore to 2.18 crores, and interest payments per year had more than doubled from 8,000 crores a year to 18,000 crores a year in a 5-year regime. And the bulk of those increases had come in these 2 years of mismanagement from my perspective. In this section, I will talk about the revenue accounts or the current accounts of the government of Tamil Nadu over the last 13 or so years, breaking them down regime by regime. That is the ADMK government that ran the government between 2003 and 2006, that is post the implementation of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the DMK government that was in place between 6 and 11, the ADMK government that was in place between 11 and 16, and the recently re-elected ADMK government and its plans for this year, as well as the data we got on February 1st showing progress for the first 6 months. As you can see from the slide, in the first 3 years after the FRA was passed, the ADMK government basically ran a flat revenue budget. It was marginally down about 100 crores a year for a total of 317 crores over 3 years, but fairly responsible. The DMK government, on the other hand, ran a surplus of 477 crores a year for all 5-year average for a total of 2,386 crores. This was between 6 and 11. When the ADMK government took back again power 11 to 16, it really ramped up spending way ahead. As I told you, the rate of spending went up far greater than the rate of revenues, and so revenue deficits exploded to 3,400 crores a year for a total over 5 years of 17,000 plus crores. If you thought that was bad, you should look at the projections for this year, which this year alone, according to the budget that was placed on the House table in July, the projected revenue deficit was 15,800 crores. And in fact, the February 1st paper shows that the 6-month deficit was already 13,800 crores for a projected total of over 27,000 crores this year. Now, one of the things one should think about is not just steady state progress, but how one deals with unexpected situations. And here again, we have a beautiful case study for us to analyze. Between 2006 and 11, the first 3 years, if you remember, the global economy was doing well, and so was the economy of India and Tamil Nadu. And during that time, the DMK regime ran a surplus of almost 6.23% a year. 2008-9, the global financial crisis hit, and between 9-10 and 10-11, the DMK government implemented the full 6th pay commission recommendations of several thousand crores of increased pay and salary and pensions. And as a consequence, it ended up having 2 years of revenue deficits of roughly 5.11% a year. On average, though, because it had been doing well before the crisis hit, it still managed a 5-year average of 1.7% revenue surplus. Compare that to the ADMK government of 11 to 16. In the first 3 years, they were running a fairly responsible government. Not great, but almost flat in revenue, not unlike the 2003 to 6 period. However, in 2014-15 and 15-16, this discipline completely was blown out of the water, as I mentioned during my budget speech, and the revenue deficits reached 7.25% a year on average, and so the overall 5-year average turned out to be about 2.56% revenue deficit. Again, the difference that happened in late September 2014, if you remember, was that the former chief minister was convicted in Bangalore at the Sessions Court and went briefly to jail, then came out of bail, then had all kinds of health issues, and basically was not functioning at full capacity between September 2014, which was the fiscal year 14-15, subsequently up to the elections. You can draw your own conclusions what the correlation is between her functional capacity and the government's outcome, but this data tells a very interesting story. And if you think that's bad, you should consider what the budget for this year said, which is a projected revenue deficit already in the budget of 10.7%. Remember, the FRA's target is 0%. This is showing a minus 10% deficit, and the half-year data suggests they will end up at an unheard of 21% revenue deficit if the first 6 months is repeated the second 6 months. How do you end up with such a bad deficit? The first part of having a bad deficit is if your revenues don't grow, as I said earlier. Now you can see in 5 years of the DMK government, whatever number the ADMK government passed off to the DMK in terms of revenue receipts, in 5 years it grew that by over 100%. So for every 1 rupee of revenue receipts as of March 31st, 2006, in March 31st, 2011, that was 2 rupees and 5 paisa. Compare that to the ADMK, and all it grew was 85 paisa, so from 1 rupee to 185. This 20% gap, as you can see, widens. In good years, the DMK did better by about 10%, and in bad years, it did better by another 10%, and so the overall difference was 20%. Just to put that in context, that 20% difference in revenue, if the ADMK had grown its revenue receipts at the same pace as the DMK, it would have resulted in another 14,000 crores of revenue receipts last 15-16 compared to what was actually received. Of course, you have to have a second failure as well, not just the first failure of revenue receipts. The second failure has to be how you spend the money. And again, you can tell that in all other revenue expenditures except interest, the DMK, if it started out getting 1 rupee spent on it as 2006 handoff from the ADMK, by the time it gave back in 2011, it was spending 2 rupees 38 paisa. Massive growth in non-interest spending. Compared to that, the ADMK only grew at about 90 paisa for every rupee. On the other hand, what about spending on interest payments? The DMK government in 5 years only grew interest payments by 60 paisa for every rupee that had been left. Or in other words, it got a payment of roughly 5,000 crores a year in 2006. When it finished 5 years later, it was paying roughly 8,000 and change crores a year. The ADMK government, on the other hand, taking over that 8,000 something crores a year in 2011, by the time it finished 2016, was paying 18,300 plus crores a year in interest. Massive difference in the quality of spending. Think back to the RBI report. What is the difference in quality of spending and what it does to growth? Let me put all of that together in one concluding slide. If you look at a responsible government, it grows the rate of non-interest spending much faster than it grows the rate of interest spending. And on that basis, you look at the DMK in good years, it grew the rate of non-interest or program plus salary plus pension plus maintenance spending 47% faster than interest spending. And in bad years, not so much, but still ended up with 76% difference over 5 years. The ADMK in good years, that is, while this former chief minister was in full capacity, already was growing interest payments 11% faster than non-interest spending on all other programs, benefits, salaries, pensions, and in the course of 5 years ended up at 32% faster growth of interest payments. That is, the quality of government spending deteriorated rapidly in these 5 years. With that, let me conclude this section on revenue management. I hope you have seen the breakdown of not just how regime A and regime B worked, but also how you stay prepared for unintended consequences by making hay while the sun shines, running a responsible government so that should you get a shock, you have the capacity to absorb it, compared to if you're already running flat out with zero margin when you have good times, when you have bad times, and in this case the bad times were not so much economic as they were political or based on an individual's health and ability, you still have serious repercussions. In this section, let me talk a little about fiscal account management. Again, when you look at fiscal account management, it's a stark contrast between what the DMK did between 2006-11 and what the ADMK did between 11 and 16. If you look at for every dollar or rupee of capital investment made by the ADMK government when it handed over in 2005-06, 5 years later the DMK had made that 3 rupees and 31 paisa. Massive growth in investment, which is a precursor to getting good growth. Better roads, more bridges, more hospitals, more schools, better sewage systems, better factories. On the other hand, the ADMK government, when it took over from the DMK government in 2011, in 5 years was only able to grow capital investments less than 50%. That is a huge difference between 331 for every 1 rupee compared to 1 rupee 50 paisa for every 1 rupee. Now what's really scary about this is that we are going to pay the consequences of the lack of investment for many years in the future. And to put the scale of this lack of investment in context, if the ADMK government had grown 5 years capital investment at the same pace as the DMK government had grown, it would have invested last year 46,000 plus crores in capital investment. In fact, it invested only about 20,000 crores, so less than half of what it should have, or a gap of about 25,500 crores. The height of irresponsibility is not just investing less. The height of irresponsibility is investing less and borrowing more. And here you have a situation where in the course of 5 years, the DMK government only raised the total debt 78%, while simultaneously raising capital investment 331 or 231 plus 100, because it was able to finance a lot of investment from revenue surpluses. The ADMK, on the other hand, because it was already using a lot of the fiscal deficit to finance revenue deficits, raised the debt faster despite investing less as a percentage in capital investments. So you can see here, in the 5 years, the ADMK government raised the debt by over 100%. For every rupee of debt they inherited in 2011, they finished 2016 at 114% higher. In rupee terms, that equals about 37,000 crores in extra debt. Now, step back for a second, if you don't mind, and look at what the revenue records look like. Here is a graph that shows every bar that year's revenue surplus or deficit, and the line, the cumulative revenue surplus or deficit over the last 13 years, ever since the implementation of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And here you can see that the first 11 or so years, the system was fairly in control, never had a deficit greater than 5,000 crores accumulated, and at one point had as high as 8,300 crore revenue surplus. In the last 3 years, that has just plummeted and completely gone out of control, and you're seeing levels that you've never seen before. In other words, if you look at this number, at the end of last year, the accumulated value of the last 13 years was 15,000 crores. This year alone, we're going to more than double that. So, a different way of looking at this is, if you borrow as a government, what are you using the borrowing for? Here on the left, you see the DMK government's 5 years. For every rupee it borrowed in fiscal deficit, it invested 167 in capital this year, 223 this year, 117 this year, and then the difficult years less. For an average over 5 years, every rupee it borrowed, it invested 1 rupee 32 paisa. ADMK government, on the other hand, because it was borrowing mostly to finance revenue deficits in terms of rupee terms, because revenue spending is much greater than capital spending, it ended up doing very little capital investment. For an average of only 90% of the fiscal deficit was invested in capital, and 10% of it was for revenue deficits. Now, some people will say, well, because of inflation, because of the value of the rupee dropping, and therefore the numbers looking bigger, this is not a fair comparison. I have done a scaling that removes all such biases from the system. And that is to say, let's look at capital investment, revenue deficits or surpluses, and fiscal deficits, all as a percentage of the size of the economy or the GSDP. And here you see the clear difference. On average, the DMK invested 2.5% of GSDP into capital, financed 0.32 of that from revenue surpluses, and therefore ran a fiscal deficit of 2.18%. The 5-year ADMK regime invested slightly less in capital, but ran a revenue deficit instead of a surplus, and therefore had to borrow almost 0.5% more a year of its GSDP, which is a large number, in fiscal deficit. This year was already projected to be the worst year on record at 1.8%, a meager 1.8% of GSDP in capex, a huge 1.16% in fiscal deficit, leading to a total of, or in revenue deficit, leading to a total fiscal deficit of 2.96%, conveniently under the 3% barrier that the FRA Act requires. In fact, the half-year figures suggest we will do much, much worse than that. 1% capex, or capital investment, 2.5%, never before heard of in the history of Tamil Nadu, revenue deficit, leading to a total of 3.5% of GSDP fiscal deficit. Don't let the small variations in numbers fool you. 1% of GSDP is a huge number. The GSDP of Tamil Nadu this year is projected to be about 13,65,000 crores, which means 1% is 13,650 crores. Or the 2% or 1.5% difference here is roughly 20,000 crores. That is a lot of money. That is roughly twice the entire budget for the municipal administration, urban administration, and water development department of the government of Tamil Nadu. In this section, we are going to wrap up all the things we covered before, including the revenue and fiscal performance, and put it in perspective and talk a little bit about what the future holds. This year will be by far the worst year in the history of Tamil Nadu as far as financial management goes. This graph shows many of the numbers we've already spoken about in terms of revenue surplus or deficit, increase in annual interest payments, as well as increase in the overall debt over a period of government. You can see that in the 5 years of the ADMK government, the 5 years of the DMK government between 2006 and 11, there was a total revenue surplus of about 2,400 crores. Interest payments per year increased by about 3,100 crores, and the debt overall increased by about 44,000 crores, all of which and more was invested in capital investments. In the 5 years of the ADMK government, the revenue deficit itself was about 17,000 crores. Interest payments per year increased by 10,000 crores a year, and the debt increased by over 1 lakh crores, roughly 1,14,000 crores. Much of that went to finance revenue deficits. You can see the 17,000 crores, and only about 90% of it went into capital investments. If that was bad, this year's budget already called for the worst ever scenario. A 16,000 crore deficit, greater than the accumulated revenue surplus or deficit over the last 13 years. Annual payments for interest increasing by 3,000 crores and debt increasing by 40,000 crores. In fact, the 6-month numbers show that this is going to be even worse than the budget projected, and we're going to end up having roughly twice the revenue deficit this year as the last 13 years. An increase in both debt and interest payments this year than the 5 years of the DMK government combined. How do we end up with this situation, and where do we go from here? The first point that I keep returning to is the fact that the revenues of the government are growing much slower than GSDP and expenses are growing much faster. So why are the revenues growing slower? Is it because commercial tax collection is defunct? Is it because there's a lot of corruption happening? It's not clear, but further analysis will be done. What is happening to revenue expenditure? Of course, interest payments are going up, but non-interest payments, if even payments to MLAs are getting returned as not cashable, imagine what is happening to the weakest of the weak, people who are receiving old age pensions, widower pensions, disability pensions. Where is this revenue spending going? It's clear there's a lot of corruption going on. This year's revenue deficit will be more than the last 13 years according to the budget. And what I'm most concerned about is when the state of finances are already so poor, the government has no leeway to deal with unexpected disasters. Unlike the way the DMK government in 2009 could deal with the slowing global economy and the 6th Pay Commission, the ADMK government has not left itself any room to deal with, for example, just in the last 6 months, demonetization, drought, Varda, oil spill, the protests, and the demise of the former chief minister. And things will get a lot worse is what I'm mostly afraid about. In addition to all this debt, in addition to low capital investment, which will lead to much lower growth, we are facing strong headwinds. I can categorically say that Vision 2023 will not turn out to be a vision but a hallucination. There is no way that the government of Tamil Nadu will achieve anywhere near the goals of the Vision 2023 document. In addition, we have major challenges looming. For example, simply the Uday scheme alone will transfer over 20,000 crores of debt from the TNEB onto the government of Tamil Nadu's balance sheet and raise all the wrong ratios like debt to GDP, GSDP, and make it difficult for us to borrow that volume of money and increase borrowing costs in terms of interest rates. In addition, the 7th Pay Commission report will have to be implemented in the next year and will most likely result in another 25,000 crore revenue expense in terms of salaries, pensions, benefits, etc. I want to conclude by putting this in perspective of every single man, woman, and child in Tamil Nadu. Let's compare what the performance of the ADMK government 5 years compared to the DMK government 5 years should have been. If the ADMK government had managed revenues at the level the DMK government did and raised revenue receipts, it should have received 14,000 crores more, and in fact it received that much less, which is a loss of about 1,950 rupees per person per year. It is also spending about 30,000 crores a year less in non-interest spending compared to the growth rate of the DMK government, which is about 4,000 plus rupees per person per year. It is paying 5,000 crore rupees more in interest per year compared to the rate at which the DMK government grew interest payments over 5 years. It increased the overall debt by 37,000 crores more than the rate at which the DMK government increased the debt, another 5,100 rupees per person. And all this while growing capital investments by 25,500 crores less in its final year of government. This year will turn out to be even worse. This year's 47,000 crore increase in debt is equal to a per capita increase of about 6,500 rupees per person, and the interest payments alone will be about 442 rupees per person. Taken together, we see slower growth and spiraling debt. I would have, under normal circumstances, stopped my presentation at this point, except for the fact that the government of Tamil Nadu, in its desperation, on the midnight of the 4th of March, implemented a draconian increase in the VAT on petrol and diesel. And I felt that it was important that I address this issue before I conclude my presentation. If you look at how a government raises its revenues, there are two types of taxes, direct taxes and indirect taxes. By definition, direct taxes are progressive. The more you make, the more you pay. Income taxes are an example of direct taxes. Indirect taxes, on the other hand, like excise, like VAT, like sales tax, are indirect taxes because everybody who buys, everybody who consumes ends up paying. And what that automatically means is that poorer and middle income people will end up spending more of their income or of their net worth every year, therefore end up having more taxable goods and services, and therefore as a percentage of their income or wealth will end up paying much more in these indirect taxes than rich people who will only spend some small portion of their income or wealth and save the rest. That is why the golden standard for the proportion of taxes that should come from progressive schemes such that the rich pay more is supposed to be 65%. In all developed economies, the benchmark is 65% direct progressive taxes, 35% indirect regressive taxes. In fact, in India, it's exactly the opposite. 35% progressive taxes, 65% indirect taxes. To make matters worse, in the last 3 years, the BJP government at the center has massively hiked its dependence on indirect taxes, and in particular on excise taxes in petrol and diesel. So it has raised the level of excise from around 2.75% in diesel to over 12%, and 4.75% in petrol to over 11%, thereby keeping the bulk of the benefits of the lowering of oil price into its own coffers and taking effectively the money from the poor and the middle class compared to the rich. This move by the ADMK government yesterday is walking in the exact footsteps of the BJP government and regressively taking money from the poor and the middle class much more than the rich. It is going to hurt people widely, and it is going to raise the cost of goods like vegetables, like fish, like construction materials that have to be transported throughout the state, and is going to have a serious negative consequence on future growth because of added costs that were brought in. We may in fact even see inflation rise because of this move. But even that doesn't worry me as much as the final question I will leave you with today. Oil prices that used to be about $110 a barrel have dropped to roughly 50-ish now after going as low as 30 and coming back. And yet, we are paying roughly the same per liter of petrol in Tamil Nadu or diesel as we did when oil was at 110. Of course, that means that the central government and the state government are making much more money per liter on the backs of the common man. But that's not the biggest risk. The biggest risk to me is what happens if oil prices rise again? What happens if oil prices go back to 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 or heaven forbid $100 a barrel? What will the government then do? Will it declare itself bankrupt by not raising or in fact lowering the excise and VAT to match the oil price? Or will it allow petrol to climb to 100 or 125 or 130 rupees a litre and diesel to climb to 80 or 90 or 100 rupees a litre and basically stall economic growth and curb economic activity around? I make the point again, if you have already used every resource available and still your performance is bad, you have zero room for countering things that can happen beyond your control, such as a growth in the price of oil. With that, I conclude my fifth and final section, and thank you for having joined me for this report.